Shall we begin? Let's begin.
Hello everyone, welcome to Crippy Gaming. I'm your host and resident, Crippy, the Pink Crusader. Today, we are going to be talking about controllers. For people with mobility issues in their hands, there's a couple of different things you need to keep in mind when looking for a controller and kind of deciding how and which you want to interact with your game and your console. Now, in terms of the games themselves and the way in which they control, that's entirely up to the developers. It also has a lot to do with control remapping, whether or not that's available in-game, and whether or not you know how to remap the controls within your current gen's console software itself. However, button remapping in and of itself is not necessarily a controller issue, but more of a console thing. So we'll cover that in another video. But today we're going to cover some of the controllers that I think work really well for people with mobility issues, and some of the pros and cons of each one. So the first controller I'd like to cover is the DualShock 4 for the PS4. The PlayStation controller hasn't changed a lot over the years. Since the release of the DualShock controller on the PS1, the controllers have had pretty much the same layout. Unlike the older versions of the DualShock controller, this controller happens to have, instead of a start and select button, a share button and an options button. And this has mostly to do with the fact that the operating system on the PS4 is dramatically different in the way in which you control these things. The options button oftentimes functions as the start button, while the share button is only used in the PS4's ability to share gameplay, take video, and take snapshots of your gameplay. It also has this nice little touchpad that also serves as a button, and this comes in handy in some of the games that are cross-platform, such as Final Fantasy XIV, in which you can actually use this to control the mouse cursor. And of course, it's motion sensitive, which functions a lot with the PS4 camera and just kind of other games in general. The nice thing about the DualShock 4 is it also comes with a fully rechargeable battery. The next controller I'd like to talk about and describe before I get into some of the pros and cons is the Xbox One controller. The Xbox One controller is not so different in shape or design than the DualShock 4. The most notable difference between these two is the lack of a touchpad and the positioning of the thumbsticks and the D-pad. And this has some interesting kind of things to it. It makes the controller different in your hand position, and it has some drawbacks in terms of functionality. For me personally, another major difference between these two controllers is the bottom trigger buttons. On the DualShock 4, there is no plastic guarding the trigger buttons. So the nice thing about the Xbox One controller is that when resting it on your lap, it has slightly less issues. Also, keep in mind that the Xbox One controller does not come as a fully rechargeable controller. It requires batteries to operate. However, you can buy rechargeable batteries for it. All in all, it's a very solid controller and it feels really good in your hand, and there's a lot good about it, and there's also some cons to it. So let's get into the pros and cons of each of these controllers in terms of what you want to do. Now, right out of the box, the Xbox One controller is probably going to be a bit more functional for you. The reason for that has a lot to do with its design, and more importantly, the design that I previously talked about, in that it has plastic part of the shell comes up and stops the trigger buttons from being pushed when you're doing other things with the controller as it's resting on your lap. If you want to push these trigger buttons, you need to do it on purpose. You're not really likely to do it on accident, unlike the PS4 controller. I push those buttons all the time on accident on the PS4. So you kind of have to learn with the PS4 controller more where it's positioned on your leg. So there is some issues in terms of the functionality of this controller in particular, with the swapping of the D-pad and the left analog stick. And this has to do with the position of my hands in terms of accessing the D-pad. With the PS4 controller, it seems it's a much more natural switch to pushing the D-pad and after using the analog stick. Most of the time when I have to do something like that with the Xbox One controller, the design of the controller itself right here gets in the way from my ability to access the flat portion of the D-pad. And that's just because it's inset a little ways. And so this now becomes something that I have to lift and adjust my shoulder and wrist in order to push these buttons. And the reason why it's easier on the DualShock 4, as you can see, the thumbstick is higher than this, and also the curvature of the controller right here is less in the way because this is now raised. This makes a difference in functionality for someone who has to adjust their hand more to reach the different ones. If I'm going to be completely honest, if my hands worked, this might actually be a more comfortable design now that the Xbox controllers are smaller and they fit into people's hands that aren't like the Duke from the original Xbox. But because of my mobility limitations, having this be so low means that this is always going to get in my way when I'm trying to push this button, the buttons on the D-pad. So that's just something you have to keep in mind. So while the Xbox controller right out of the gate might be a little bit more functional for you and cause you a little less of problems and slip-ups, the PS4 controller is probably going to end up being more functional overall. And part of that has to do with one of its drawbacks. One of its drawbacks, like I said before, is that the trigger buttons don't have any defense from being pushed while on your lap because the plastic is underneath it rather than in front of it. However, this comes into benefit once you've practiced on this controller a bit and learn how to control it a little bit more, because it allows you to depress both of these trigger buttons at the same time by tilting the controller and pushing it into your leg. This comes in handy on games like Arkham, the Batman Arkham games, because in games that require you to actively push both of these buttons down to engage a certain action, because you can actually still use the directional buttons and depress those buttons at the same time, where if you need to do something similar on the Xbox One controller, you're probably going to basically be upending the controller completely. And so pushing both of these buttons and controlling a directional button is almost impossible with mobility issues with the Xbox One controller. Not so with the PS4 controller. And so in terms of being able to do more things with this controller, you're probably going to be able to do more with it. But it's going to feel a little bit frustrating in the beginning. Now, in terms of Nintendo consoles, I haven't owned one since an SNES. The Nintendo Switch is actually the first Nintendo console that I've actually been interested in getting, because the control scheme that comes with the Joy-Cons and their little Joy-Con controller holder actually makes the controller function a lot like the Xbox One controller. This means that I can actually utilize that controller. A lot of the motion controls and everything like that simply out of my range of ability to do. I would have had to get the classic controllers for both the Wii and the Wii U. And in terms of out-of-the-box play, the initial barrier to the controllers, the Xbox and the PlayStation, in the previous and probably the current generations, is just more user-friendly for someone who has mobility issues in their hands. However, if you are interested in getting a Nintendo console, I recommend jumping in on the Switch, because you're likely going to have a more easy out-of-the-box experience playing a lot of those games. You also have to take into consideration that you're probably not going to ever get the full functionality of your console, because a lot of the games that are coming out on the Switch utilize the Joy-Cons as kind of they were meant to do, in one hand each, moving around and doing things. You're not likely to be able to control them in that way. And also, the two-player functionality on those little tiny Joy-Cons not very good in terms of your ability to make them function. While a giant controller is not necessarily a good idea, one that's also too small is probably even more of a problem. Both of the controllers that we went over are very similar to their predecessors, so a lot of what I said still applies. The PS3 controllers, if you want to go with an older console, function pretty much the same as a DualShock 4. They have the same drawbacks and some of the same pros as well. And the Xbox 360 controller really isn't much different than the Xbox One controller in terms of its functionality. Now, if you're looking for a controller that works really well for your PC as well as your console, you're better off probably going with an Xbox controller, because it's Microsoft, and Microsoft likes to make all of their hardware play well together. What company doesn't? You have to download extra software to get your PS4 controller to work on a PC, but once you do that, it works just fine. I've used my PS4 controller on my computer before, and I think it works pretty great, actually. However, right out of the gate, it's easier to link your Xbox One controller, and I think if you really want to get right down to it, if you want to pick a controller for your computer, you're probably best to go with a wired Xbox 360 controller. There's really no configuration involved in that. You plug it into a USB port and you play. So it's probably your best option. You can do that with an Xbox One controller as well. The little mini USB port in the front allows you to connect it via USB, and you can also do it over wireless as well, but I highly recommend a wired controller for a computer because there's much less latency when you push the buttons. So I hope you got some good information from this video. If you liked the content, please consider subscribing, and to all of you gamers out there, I hope you have a fantastic day and enjoy gaming, and I will see you later. Take care.